Chapter 6. For supper that night, Alice made a simple stew she'd cooked for her family more times than she could count. There would need to be a trip to the mercantile very soon, but for the time being, she had few things she could make from the selection of foods in the house. She knew she could always borrow from her sister, or eat with them if it came to that, but she preferred to prove to her sister and herself that she could feed her new husband. Shortly before Albert was due to arrive home from his day of work, Alice mixed up dough for biscuits, and she popped them into the oven, knowing they would help stretch her stew and make it tastier. When Albert came into the house shortly before 8, he sniffed deeply. "This house has never smelled so good," he called out, hanging up his hat and coat on the hooks by the front door. "I'm glad it smells good. I hope it tastes good too." She knew it did because she'd had a tiny bowl of stew and a biscuit while she waited for him. She hated that she couldn't serve the biscuits hot because of his tardiness, but there was no point in saying anything. He washed his hands and sat at the table, waiting for her to put the food on and serve him, just as her father always had. As soon as they each had a bowl of stew and a biscuit, he lowered his head to pray. She could tell he'd been trained particularly well in prayer, and she understood why. Her sister was very active in their church from what she'd said that afternoon. He took a bite of the stew and smiled. "It's pretty good. I really do need more supplies to make good meals," she said softly. "How was your day today?" He shrugged. "Like usual. Lots more calves born. Sometimes the cows wander off to the strangest places to have them, and then we can't find them if they need help." She looked at him and realized that his blue work shirt had blood all over it. She'd have to work to get the blood out when she did laundry. "Have you lost any calves?" she asked. He shook his head. "No, not even the twin that seemed too weak." He's perked up, and she's nursing him without a problem. That's always a danger with twins when one is weak. That the mother will reject him, and we'll have to either bottle feed or find another heifer who will take him on. "I see. What happens next? After all the calves have been born? Then the real work starts. We must brand them and castrate the males. Then they feed all summer, growing bigger, while we constantly move them for good grazing. And then in the end, we drive them to market. Thankfully, the stockyards in Fort Worth aren't terribly far to take the young steers." "That's where you sell them?" she asked. He nodded. "I prefer to only keep about 3 bulls, so all the steers are sold. Other ranchers or even farmers raise them for their meat." "I see. Have you always wanted to be a cattle rancher?" He shrugged. "I guess when I was a little boy, I wanted to be a horse trainer like my pa, but I grew fascinated with the cattle we raised." His parents were cattle ranchers, and he kept up a big herd, but he mostly let his men take care of them, and he concentrated on training horses if he could. "My brothers are all interested in horse training and following in pa's footsteps, but not me." "Sounds like you know what you want, and that's a good thing. I can also train my own horses without a problem, but I think I'll let pa handle that from now on. No need for me to waste my time doing something he can do better and faster." She nodded. "A couple of my brothers have ended up as cattle ranchers because they moved west and married women who had ranches. Elizabeth tends to use her siblings to send west to marry the people who write her." "I didn't know that." "Well, I'm living proof." "How did it come about that Elizabeth ended up running the business instead of the woman Susan talked about, Harriet, I think?" Alice grinned. "I love this story. Harriet ran the business for a few years, but she had been writing one of the men for that entire time. Instead of finding him a wife, she decided to be that wife herself. She was going to close down the business, but Elizabeth saw her and asked who was going to help the women in town who were in difficult situations. Harriet not only gave her the business, but she gave her the house she'd been living in. Harriet came from extreme wealth, while we were the children of a poor dirt farmer. I had no idea. I thought she bought the business or something." Not at all. She was just willing to take on the business of helping others, and Harriet agreed with her that someone needed to help the women in town who were in abusive situations, or who needed to leave town quickly. There's always someone who needs to leave town quickly. He ate 3 full bowls of the stew before they were finished with supper, and she was thrilled he liked it enough to eat so much. After the meal, he went out to do his evening chores, while she did the dishes and tidied up the kitchen. When he came back inside, Alice wasn't sure what to do with him. In the evenings, her father always read the newspaper while her mother sewed. Perhaps that would suit him, but she wasn't aware of a newspaper anywhere. "Would you mind if I sewed this evening?" she asked. He shook his head. "I need to do some bookwork anyway. I'm trying to keep a tally of all the calves born this spring. I'm sure one of my neighbors rustled a few head last year, but because I didn't keep good records, I couldn't prove it." Alice took her sewing to the table, while he spread papers out and got to work. She didn't try to make conversation, because she didn't know if he needed to concentrate more than that. Though their first night together hadn't been bad, it seemed to her that tonight, when they were each doing their own things, was harder than the first. She didn't know how to act with him, doing normal things that couples did. It felt odd to be alone with a man she barely knew, even though she'd been intimate with him the night before. "You think too loud," Albert said as he made some marks on his sheet. "What does that mean?" "I can feel your discomfort. We must get used to each other, and part of that is getting used to there being silence between us. We can't talk every minute we're together." "Well, I never thought we would," Alice said, feeling a bit picked on. "I thought we'd sleep a lot too." He chuckled, reaching out and gripping her hand. "Susan said this would be the hardest part of things, and she was right. She's been through it all before, so of course, she's right. At least she and Pa could always talk about how poorly he disciplined his boys." "Did they really talk about that?" Alice asked. "Oh, yes. I sometimes heard them arguing. Susan was certain we'd both end up in prison if she didn't do something about it." She chuckled. "But you didn't." "No, not yet anyway." With him breaking the ice that way, she felt more comfortable working in silence for the rest of the evening, glad he knew how to make her feel at ease. When it was time for bed, she had no problem changing in front of him, but when she was about to pull her nightgown over her head, he plucked it from her fingers and tossed it to the floor. "I have a feeling you won't be needing that tonight," he said, pulling her toward him. "Is that so?" she asked. Albert grinned. "Oh, yeah. Asterisk." On Saturday, they finally went to get supplies. "What's my budget?" Alice asked when Albert pulled up in front of the store. "Just get everything we need, but not everything we want." She sighed. "So, if I feel like I need fabric for curtains?" She hated there were no curtains on their bedroom window. She felt like she was putting on a show, even though they'd never seen anyone outside the window. "Then get some fabric." She frowned. "And if I feel like I need beautiful dishes for guests?" "Rein yourself in." Alice felt like she understood then. "All right. Let me see what I can do." He jumped down from the wagon and helped her, and they went inside together. Almost immediately, he was flagged down by someone, and he stopped and talked to them, while she found what she needed in the store. For the most part, she just purchased food, but she found some fabric for curtains, and a nice vase for some of the wildflowers she enjoyed picking. There was a small section of the store completely devoted to seeds, and she found herself choosing many of the different things, some she'd never even tasted. She was interested in growing a garden, and she figured it was worth it to try whatever she wanted. She even found some blackberry seeds, imagining the jams she would one day be able to make. She and Susan had talked about putting in their kitchen gardens together and working on them as a team. As much as Alice hated weeding, she knew it would be a great deal more enjoyable with her sister. She purchased several different types of canned goods since her garden wouldn't be ready for several months, and a large slab of bacon for their breakfasts. By the end of her trip, she knew she'd chosen too many things, and she was standing looking at the counter, completely covered with her purchases, trying to decide what she should put back. "Is that all you need?" Albert asked from behind her. Alice turned to him. "All? There's nothing else?" "I figured you'd want curtains for the kitchen and a tablecloth to match. You seem to like those girly things." "I would like those things. May I choose a fabric and add it to my order?" "I told you to get whatever you needed." "Sounds like you need that." Alice was shocked at how much he was willing to spend on things she felt were luxuries. She'd had no idea she'd married a generous man. After he had paid the merchant, she'd walked away when he gave the total, not wanting to even know how much she'd spent. Someone helped him load the wagon, and they made the drive back toward home. Just as they reached the edge of town, he stopped the wagon, jumped down, and helped her to her feet. "Let's eat at the diner. You shouldn't have to cook the noon meal after so much shopping." She gaped at him for a moment, but she wasn't one to look a gift horse in the mouth. "I'd enjoy that." They went into the establishment and took a table back in one corner of the room. A waitress sashayed over to them, smiling coyly at Albert. "Well, if it isn't the eldest Dailey boy." "Hi, Abigail. How's business?" She shrugged. "Mostly good. Now that Bob's gone, it's easier to do what I want to do here. I don't have to listen to his ideas for meals or keep his drunken self from scaring my customers away." "That's good." He looked behind her to the menu written on a blackboard across the room. "I want chicken fried steak, mashed potatoes, and sweet tea to drink." Alice had been so busy watching the woman flirt with her husband, she hadn't even looked at the menu. "I'll have the same," she said. "Who are you anyway?" Abigail asked. "I'm Alice Dailey, Albert's new wife." The waitress looked annoyed and spun on her heel to go back toward the kitchen. "Who was that?" Alice asked. "She's a girl who went to my school. She married Bob as soon as she turned 16, but Bob turned out to be an unpleasant sort. He was killed in a shootout in Hell's Half Acre, and Abigail is panting after any man who crosses her path as a result." "I see." Alice felt better hearing him talk about the other woman that way. She'd been worried he had feelings for her. "You never courted?" He laughed. "She wouldn't have given me the time of day. She only flirts with me now because she's a widow with 2 small children, and she wants to find them a father. If I was interested, I'd have already married her." "That makes sense." Alice looked down for a moment, pleased that she didn't have to be jealous of the pretty waitress. "Tell me about the girl you wanted to marry." "Oh, Sarah? I just had a crush on her in school, and then I found out she was going to marry an old school friend, so I moved on. It wasn't a big deal." "So, if you found out tomorrow that he'd been run over by a billy goat and died a horrible death with the billy goat's horn stuck through his eyeballs, you wouldn't wish you hadn't married me?" Albert looked at his wife with wide eyes. "Are you saying you want her husband to be murdered by a billy goat?" "Not at all. I'm just asking a question." "It's an odd question," he said. Alice shrugged. "My teachers always said my imagination ran toward the macabre." "I can agree with that." Albert shook his head. "No, I wouldn't be interested in her." "Why would I? I have a beautiful wife whom my family already loves, who I am growing to care about more every day. Sarah was just a girl who didn't return my affections." "Well, I guess that's good." He laughed. "Are you really jealous of Sarah?" "Jealous? Not really. More curious than anything else. I wonder if she has long dark hair and beautiful eyes." "What attracted you to her?" "She didn't ask a lot of questions," Albert said, winking at her. Alice laughed, but still she was curious. "Will I meet her in church tomorrow?" You will. I'll look forward to that then. Meeting the girl he'd hoped to marry would be interesting for her. What if she really did have long chestnut locks? Alice had always thought her blonde hair and blue eyes were boring. Suddenly, she felt inadequate. She hoped the feeling went away quickly. Chapter 7. Alice barely slept on Saturday night, nervous about meeting her new church family for the first time. Even though she knew she'd have Susan and Albert both there, it still felt like it was a scary thing that was about to happen. She finally gave up on sleep around 4:30 in the morning and went out into the parlor to sew by lamplight. She preferred to sew by natural light because then she could see her stitches more clearly, but she had to occupy her hands if not her mind. When Albert got up just before 6, she went into the kitchen to start cooking their breakfast. "Are you all right?" Albert asked, noting her bloodshot eyes and exhausted countenance. "I'm fine. Just sleepy. I'm nervous about going to a new church and didn't sleep well." Alice didn't know why it was such a nerve-wracking thing for her, but it was. As much as she wanted to meet new people in the community, she was afraid to do it. It made no sense, so she didn't tell Albert exactly what was on her mind. It would make no sense to him either, and then he'd think she was a lunatic. While she cooked, he did the chores. She decided to make pancakes because she'd gotten some maple syrup at the store Saturday, and it would be wonderful on the pancakes. Besides, pancakes were a little more complicated than her usual breakfast, and she needed to take her mind off going to church. Her entire life, she'd attended one church, and one church only. It would be strange to go to a new one. He brought in the milk pail and the basket of eggs he'd gathered, setting them on the counter for her. "Thanks. You know, I really need to make butter this week. I hate using store-bought. It just doesn't taste as good." Albert recognized her attempt to take his mind off her nerves for what it was, but he agreed with her instead of making her talk about going to church. "I prefer home-churned butter as well. But it's so much work. Susan switched to store-bought years ago. I'm used to it. We never used store-bought butter in Beckham." "What are your parents like?" he asked. She shrugged. "Normal parents, I guess. Very easygoing. They didn't mind anything we did really. The only time I remember Ma even getting upset with us was when I threw apples at the pastor as he drove past and hit him in the head, leaving a bruise. Even that didn't have her yelling at us though. Susan would have lost her mind." "I'm sure she would have. What was your mother like?" "I don't have a lot of memories of her. I wish I had more. She made us do what was right. She baked cookies and told us bedtime stories. I don't seem to have any memories of her before she was carrying the twins. Anytime I try to remember her, she has that huge belly." "How did she die?" Alice asked. She was surprised no one had told her yet. "Childbirth with the twins, and after that, Pa had no idea what to do with us. He went through so many different nannies, trying to find one who would stick around. None of them seemed to like frogs in their beds though. Our teachers were never fond of frogs either. I don't know what's wrong with people." "Did you have lots of different teachers?" Albert asked, glad the topic was off his mother. It had always been a difficult topic for him, though she'd been gone more of his life. He accepted his plate with bacon and pancakes and carried it to the table. "We did. So many teachers. Finally, the school board found a male teacher who believed in using a paddle on all of us when we misbehaved at school, and he was able to stick around. I can't count the number of times we were all paddled, though." She shook her head. "Ma and Pa hated that they beat us, but they had to agree to it for us to be able to go to school." She joined him at the table, immediately bowing her head. After the prayer, he continued the conversation. "Pa never would have agreed to that. Susan would have in a second, but not Pa. He said Ma never hit us, so no one else would either. He felt really strongly that we were raised the way Ma would have raised us. I can see that being important. She took a bite of her pancakes. Oh, this maple syrup is really good. He nodded. It's the kind Susan always buys. Well, I love it. I haven't seen any maple trees that we can use to make our own like we did in Massachusetts, but if I find some, I'll certainly go the homemade route. Though this is better than we made at home. They spent the morning reading scriptures together until it was time to leave for church. I should have put something on for our noon meal, she said as they were walking out the door. No need. We're expected at Susan's. She always has Louis and I over for Sunday meals. She wants the whole family together at least one day per week, and we all work every other day. Alice nodded. Good. I was starting to feel like the world's worst wife. My ma always put a meal in the oven before we left for church. I had planned to do the same, but in my nervousness about meeting everyone, I plumb forgot. When they stepped outside together, she realized that he'd hitched up a buggy instead of the farm wagon, which was the only thing she'd ridden in. Oh, the buggy is beautiful, she said, forgetting all about their meal plans for the day. It was black, just like the doctor's buggy had been back in Beckham. There were 2 seats and no room for anyone else. She'd often heard this type of buggy referred to as a courting buggy. It wouldn't work after children came along, but for now? It was perfect. He grinned. I thought it would be nice to have for Sunday afternoon drives, so I got it when I found out you were on your way. She spun and wrapped her arms around him. Thank you. You're welcome. He loved seeing the look of surprise on her face. Well, let's go for a ride in that beautiful buggy. Just to church for today. We'll sneak away another day, but Susan is going to want us all there today. Why's that? She asked. Albert shrugged. Because we have a new family member, of course. She's going to want to see how we are together now that we've been married a little while. Makes sense. He handed her into the buggy, and she used the lap robe he had on the floor to cover up with, holding up his half, so she could cover him with it when he joined her. This is going to make church so much more fun. He laughed. The pastor's sermons are awfully dry. All hellfire and brimstone. I don't think those will ever be fun no matter how you look at it. That's probably true. Still, I'm excited to have a buggy to ride in. Do you know I've never been in one in my whole life? My father drove the farm wagon, and I considered myself lucky to get rides in that. Mostly I walked everywhere, or I rode. She didn't add that she rode bareback, because she was certain he would be scandalized, just as her mother had been when she'd found out. It hadn't stopped her, but she'd had to be more careful to do it when her mother wasn't looking. I didn't know you ride. We'll have to go out one afternoon and just enjoy ourselves. I'd like that a lot, Alice said. She'd even learn to ride using a saddle if she had to. And she was certain she did. She was a respectable married woman now. Oh, how she wished she could still be the young heathen her mother had often called her. As they pulled into the churchyard, Alice was pleased to see that the church was much smaller than she'd envisioned. I thought we'd be going into Fort Worth for church. Not at all. We've always gone to this church, and this is where we went to school as well. It's a small church, just meant for the people who live nearby to have a close-knit community. He put the parking brake on before hurrying around to help her down from the wagon. She was wearing her Sunday best, but it was her Sunday best from a few years back, and it needed to be replaced. She hoped no one would look down on her for having an older dress. They walked to the church together, and he introduced her to a couple of the ladies in the congregation along the way. I'm going to leave you with Susan, if you don't mind. I need to talk to a friend of mine about plowing a kitchen garden for you. All right. Alice wasn't sure if her sister would help calm her nerves or make them worse. Susan seemed so confident in all she did. It made Alice feel a bit small at times. As soon as Susan saw her, she smiled and beckoned her to come closer. "I want you to meet one of my dearest friends," Susan said. "This is my friend, Wilma. Wilma, this is my sister and my daughter-in-law, Alice." Wilma smiled, but her smile seemed a little shy to Alice. "That's got to be confusing. Do you call her Susan, Ma, or just hey you?" Alice laughed. "I call her Susan. One of these days, I may just call her something else, but it might not be as nice as it could be." Wilma laughed softly. She obviously had a good sense of humor. "We need to welcome you by having a sewing day," she said. "I'll bring my cookies." "I'll host," Susan said. "We'll invite Beverly as well, and we need to find someone nearer to Alice's age." It was then she spotted a young woman she called over. "Alice, this is Sarah Peterson. She just got married a few weeks ago." "Sarah, my sister Alice, who just so happens to be married to Albert." Alice smiled, but it felt forced. Sarah's hair was the color of chestnuts and fell freely over her shoulders, to her back. Alice would never dare wear her hair down that way. Her mother would have called the style scandalous. "It's nice to meet you, Sarah." "You too." Sarah didn't sound like she meant it though. Susan said, "We were planning a small sewing gathering at my place on Tuesday afternoon this week. Would you care to join us?" Sarah nodded. "I'd love to. I can't wait to get to know your sister." With that, Sarah walked away, leaving Alice feeling dirty. The look Sarah had given her made her feel like the other woman resented her marriage to Albert, which made no sense to her at all. The sermon was just as Albert had said, hellfire and brimstone. After 10 minutes of the talk, Alice began daydreaming that she was anywhere else in the world. She believed in the preaching of God's love, but not so much potential punishments. Why did so many pastors feel they had to frighten their flock into doing what was right? After the sermon, they all went to Susan's house, and there was a huge pot roast, carrots, and potatoes for the noon meal. Someone had even gotten up early enough to make fresh bread. Alice would have settled for bread from the day before, but this was obviously a special meal to her sister. "What are we celebrating?" Alice asked as she helped put the food onto the table. Susan laughed. "We're celebrating our first Sunday with you as part of our family," she said. "I thought Albert would have told you." Alice shook her head. "He just said you preferred if the whole family spent the day together on Sundays." "Well, that's true, as far as it goes. I usually cook something much simpler though." Susan put a pitcher of milk on the table and called everyone for lunch. "I'm really glad you're here, Alice. Even if you pretended not to be my sister when you first arrived. Blame your 2 oldest boys for that. I was but a willing pawn in their game of chess with you." "Willing is what I have issue with," Susan said, shaking her head, though there was a slight smile on her face. "I'm excited. We'll all be getting together to sew this week. We each bring whatever project we're working on, and we visit while we stitch. Wilma makes the best cookies, and we'll have those as a break during our time. Can you come over right after the noon meal?" Alice nodded. "I'm a little nervous about getting to know Sarah, since she was the one Albert was hoping to marry." Susan shook her head. Albert wouldn't have spent more than an evening or two with Sarah before realizing she was not the woman he wanted to spend his life with. Sarah is much too fickle for him. I've heard she's already flirting with other men, and she just married a few weeks ago. Oh, that's sad. I feel badly for her husband. Don't. The two of them belong together. Everyone started to gather at the table then, but Alice couldn't quit thinking about what her sister had said. Maybe Sarah wasn't someone she should be jealous of. Perhaps she should pray for her marriage instead. Just thinking the words had her reaching over to Albert and squeezing his hand. He glanced over at her and smiled before leaning over and kissing her cheek. Louis groaned. "You two need to find somewhere private if you're going to get like that with each other." "Isn't this the privacy of my father's home?" Albert asked. By the time the meal was over, and Alice had helped Susan with the dishes and accepted a bowl of leftovers for their supper, Alice realized that she needed to stop worrying about what Sarah did. As far as she was concerned, Sarah was just a girl who couldn't seem to find happiness. She deserved her pity, nothing more. Once home, Alice put the food into the icebox and smiled at her husband. That was a lovely meal. I love how Susan and your pa just let us eat with them whenever we like. We're all one big happy family here, Albert said. How long was Susan married to your pa before you decided to accept her as your stepmother? He shrugged. Within a few weeks, I was resigned to the fact that I was stuck with her, no matter how I felt about it. I think it was when she was expecting her oldest that I realized she was there to stay, and there was nothing I could do about it, so I needed to make the best of it. That's when Louis and I slowed way down on the pranks. I can't say that we stopped entirely, because that would be a lie, but we went to 1 or 2 a week from 4 or 5 a day. Susan was happy, but so were we. I'm glad you became part of our family, so I could end up married to you. I think I'm right where I need to be. He gathered her to him and just held her for a moment. I think so too. Chapter 8. As soon as Albert left for work on Tuesday morning, Alice hurried to do her daily baking. Once her bread was punched down and rising for the second time, she got ready to leave for Susan's house, washing her face and tidying her hair. She was making certain to look nicer for this get-together at Susan's than she had for church on Sunday. It helped that her new Sunday dress was finished, and she could wear it for the first time. She'd just pressed it the night before. Alice wasn't quite certain why she felt the need to prove herself to Sarah, but she did. She wanted to be as perfect as the other girl looked, or at least come across that way. God knew she was as far from perfect as a woman could get. As she walked to her sister's house, she smiled, thinking of the beautiful new curtains she'd be working on during their sewing time. It would be fun as well as informational as she got to know the other ladies, and hopefully became friends with them. When she arrived, Susan was just sitting down to lunch with her children that weren't in school. Join us for lunch, Susan called, and it was only then Alice realized she'd forgotten to eat. I'm so nervous about this sewing party that I almost forgot to do my daily baking, and I did forget to eat lunch. There's no reason to be nervous. My friends will love you. Susan looked her up and down. Is that your new Sunday dress? It is. Do you think it's all right? I think it's beautiful, Susan replied. You know, I have 3 or 4 other dresses that are in perfect condition you may want to take. As soon as I started having babies, I stopped wearing dresses that were fitted to me, and since you're the same size I was, these should suit you perfectly. Would I seem like a beggar if I said, yes, please, to that kind offer? Alice asked with a smile. Not at all. Alice sat down and reached for some of the pot pie on the table. Did you make this? Susan laughed. Are you kidding? I spent the morning trying to teach Annabelle to go in the potty instead of in her panties. How'd that work out? Alice asked, taking a big bite of the meal. This is good. Mrs. H is a fabulous cook. I always thought I was good, but she puts me to shame, and I have let her cook more and more over the years. When I first got here, I insisted on sharing the cooking duties. Now, I may cook once a month, when I'm hungry for something Ma used to make. But I'm always well fed. Susan patted her middle, which wasn't nearly as big as it should be after so many babies. At least not in Alice's opinion. You're still absolutely beautiful, Alice said. Why does blonde hair look so beautiful on you, but so boring on me? Susan laughed, shaking her head. Because you don't think enough of yourself. You'll get there. How are things going between you and Albert? I think we're doing well. I haven't burned supper yet, and he hasn't been on time to supper yet. That's typical. Men get involved in their work and forget to go home on time. Don't let that bother you. I'm trying. After lunch, Susan and Alice took the children upstairs for their naps. Mrs. H is going to sit up here in case any of them wake up needing something, Susan told Alice as they were laying little Clarissa down. Now, let's go find those dresses. Susan knelt in front of the same trunk where she'd found the dress Alice had been married in. Are you sure you don't want to save the dresses for your daughters? Alice asked. Positive. The styles will be different by the time they're grown. Susan pulled 4 folded dresses from the chest. I think that's all, but if I find more, I'll pass them along. Alice took the pile. Thank you so much. I'm sewing as quickly as I can, but most of what I have are still the dresses I brought from home, and I didn't take time to sew before I came like you did. That's because you were working in town, Susan said. How's Ma? Alice smiled. The same as ever. I think she honestly wishes she was still having babies, but the rest of us are thrilled that she seems to have stopped. Susan laughed. I can understand that. I remember the day I found out she was carrying number 13 was the day we went to town to talk to Harriet. There was no way I was going to stay there to raise another child who wasn't my own. She shook her head. I was always so frustrated with the mischief you'd all get into. I felt like the house was missing something for the longest time after you left, Alice said. You and Elizabeth were always there for us, and Ma was always off working or lying in bed because the baby was in danger. Yeah. That's how it was for the longest time before I left. I think you were the first of her difficult pregnancies, and the doctor kept telling her it was time to stop having babies, but she just wouldn't. Susan sighed. I'm glad my pregnancies haven't been as rough as hers always were. I hope I take after you and not Ma then. I know Elizabeth hasn't really had a difficult time, but Mary did. Mary was the 3rd eldest sister, who had married and had children before Elizabeth. Do you want a big family? Susan asked. Alice nodded. I'm not sure what to do with myself in a house so empty. We need children. Susan smiled. And I thought I would be happy with no children, but I wouldn't trade any of them for all the riches in the world. Not even Albert. It sounds like Albert was a true thorn in your side. He was. He was the most difficult by far, though I wouldn't be surprised if Oliver gave him a run for his money. Oliver is my wild child. He seems so well behaved to me. That's because you're not here at bedtime. He refuses to sleep. I don't remember that from the night I was here. Susan smiled. That's because you were so exhausted you fell asleep well before the children did. She got to her feet. We should go downstairs and wait for our guests. Mrs. H made some snacks for us, and Wilma is making the best cookies this side of the Mississippi. That good, huh? Will she share her receipt? I haven't made any sweets for Albert yet. Oh, you need to. Sweets are definitely the way to that boy's heart. I'll keep that in mind. When they got downstairs, Wilma was sitting in the parlor waiting for them. No one heard me knock, so I just came in. I figured you two were upstairs on some sort of secret mission. Susan laughed. I was finding dresses that fit me before the babies started coming, and I gave them to my baby sister who can still wear them. Alice smiled. It's good to see you again, Wilma. You too, Alice. Wilma held up her sewing. I got started without you. Cookies are in the kitchen. I've heard a lot about those cookies. I don't suppose you'd share the receipt? Of course, I will. Just promise you won't take them to any of the church picnics, because I want to be the only one who makes them. Alice laughed and nodded. I'll happily make that promise. She understood how women were with their special dishes for potlucks at church. The next person to arrive was Beverly. She brought little cakes for everyone, putting them in the kitchen. It was obvious these 2 friends of Susan's spent a lot of time at her house. Should I have brought something to share? Alice asked. She suddenly felt like she'd done something wrong. Susan shook her head. You were exempt this time. Next time, you have to bring something to be allowed inside the house. Beverly sat down, in the parlor, holding up a panel she was working on. I'm making new curtains for Joy's room. She insists that her room is ugly. Alice smiled. I love the yellow gingham. It's so bright and happy looking. I'm sure Joy will be thrilled. It's a surprise for her birthday next week, so I have to work quickly, Beverly said with a smile. How old is Joy? Alice asked. It was obvious the other two knew Beverly's daughter. She's going to be 12. She thinks she's grown. Don't all girls that age? Susan asked. A loud knock on the door interrupted the conversation, and Susan jumped up. Must be Sarah. A glance at the clock told Alice the girl was 20 minutes late. Everyone else had either been early or on time. Sarah walked into the room, carrying nothing. Didn't you bring a sewing project? Susan asked. I don't feel like sewing. I'll just watch you all work. Sarah's eyes were on Alice as she took a rocking chair in one corner of the room. I suppose that's all right, Susan said, looking a little confused. Welcome. Thank you. Sarah looked at her fingernails as if she was already bored. I wouldn't have come if Jason hadn't insisted. He said I need to make friends, so I don't stay home and mess the house all day. That downright befuddled Alice. You don't clean the house? What kind of new wife made messes and didn't clean? Oh, no. Of course not. His mother comes over and cleans every day after she finishes her house. Why? Alice asked. Are you ill? Sarah glared at Alice. I'm not ill. I just don't care to clean. Jason told me he'd get me a housekeeper if I married him, and then I found out that he doesn't have the money to hire one. Sarah shook her head. I should have married Albert instead. His family has money. She looked around the room as if she planned to control the house one day. Oh, didn't you know Albert is in love with me? Alice smiled through gritted teeth. Is that so? Oh, yes. Everyone knows about it. I guess I made a poor choice choosing a man who said he had money over one who truly did. I clean my own house, Alice said. And I put supper on the table every night. I don't think you'd be in a better position married to Albert. Yes, but Albert would have hired a housekeeper for me. He wouldn't want me to get calluses on my fingers. Sarah looked pointedly at Alice. How does it feel to know your husband is in love with someone else? Alice smiled sweetly. I'm sure if he'd gotten to know you better, he would have known better than to love you. But it's all right with me. He's a good husband. Sarah laughed. Until he realizes I'm available. Is she planning to take her husband out with a billy goat's horn through the eye? How could you possibly be available? Alice asked. You're married. We'll see. Susan looked at Sarah, an alarmed look on her face. I believe you've overstayed your welcome, Sarah. I knew if Albert got to know you, he would have moved on to someone else. He definitely chose the better bride. She got to her feet. I'll walk you to the door. Sarah grunted her displeasure, but she stood up to leave. Alice didn't look up from her sewing as her sister led the other woman away from them. When Susan returned, she looked at Alice. Well, she was even more dreadful than I'd realized. Sorry to inflict her on you. Makes me wish I was still in my demon horde days, Alice muttered. Susan shook her head. You will not play any kind of prank on her. Do you hear me? Alice sighed. I won't. I want to, but I won't. Next time I'll invite someone who doesn't act like that. Beverly smiled. She was raised with a silver spoon in her mouth. No wonder she's so difficult to be around. She looked at Alice. Don't you worry about Albert. He doesn't love her. He doesn't even really know her. Wilma looked up from her sewing for just a moment. Shame on Felicity for raising that girl to be so selfish. I ought to give her a piece of my mind. Susan laughed. But you won't, and we both know it. Wilma laughed as well. No, I won't. But I should. She turned to Alice. Susan told us about the demon horde. Tell me, what was your favorite prank? It was obviously a ruse to get Alice to take her mind off what Sarah had said, but Alice was thrilled to think about something else. Alice had to think about it for a moment as Susan resettled herself and picked up her sewing. I think it's the day we caught 6 frogs and set them free in different parts of the church. Ma didn't make us sit with her, so one of us sat in the front row on the right, another on the left. And then 2 in the back, and 2 of us right in the middle. The first time the pastor said, "Turn to your Bible," we all let them go. Some of the women were standing on their pews screeching. Susan groaned. How did Ma react to that? She told us there were appropriate times for pranks and inappropriate times, and we needed to learn the difference. Alice shrugged. So, the next week, we released snakes. Laughter filled the room. It sounds like you were perfectly awful, Beverly said. You've outgrown pranks? Well, I did let Louis and Albert talk me into one when I arrived here. No one had told Susan her sister was coming, so I didn't tell her either. I was just an Alice from Beckham. It took David telling her that I looked just like she had at my age for her to realize. Wilma giggled. That's terrible of you. But funny. That was my thought. Susan and I have moved past it. I'm just glad I can get to know my sister. She left when I was only about 5. Beverly looked thoughtful. I knew she had much younger siblings, but it never occurred to me that you wouldn't really know her. I'm glad you have the chance to get to know her as well. She's a special woman. Alice looked at her big sister with a smile. I agree. Chapter 9. As she cooked supper that evening, Alice couldn't stop thinking about what Sarah had said. She wasn't going to stay married, billy goat stabbing or not, and she had her eye on Albert. There were no true feelings between her and Albert as they'd been strangers when they married, but she felt like they'd already built up a good rapport, and she was rapidly developing feelings for her husband. She wasn't about to step out of the way and let Sarah have him. She made chicken and dumplings, which Susan had told her was his favorite meal, and she made fresh bread to go with it. She timed the rolls coming out of the oven at exactly 7:45, which was when he tended to get home from work, though he said he'd be there earlier. It was 9:30 when he walked in the door, covered in mud and looking exhausted. What happened to you? She asked, feeling very perturbed with her husband. Not only had he been late coming home, but he'd done it on a day when she was feeling particularly vulnerable in her marriage, thanks to all the things Sarah had said to her. He sighed. I was out riding looking for one of our lost heifers who had crossed the stream to give birth. I tried to jump the stream, but my horse and I fell right smack into it. Thankfully it wasn't high, but I got a little wet and muddy. Then I helped the heifer calve and got her and the calf back to the herd, where she should have stayed to begin with. Do you mind if I get cleaned up before supper? Do I mind? She asked. I insist on it. He left a trail of muddy water on her clean floor as he headed toward the bathroom. She followed along behind him with her mop, cleaning up the floor as she went. She should have met him at the door with a clean towel and insisted he strip right there, so he wouldn't make a big mess all through the house. Next time. She'd do just that next time. She went into the kitchen and popped the rolls back in the oven for just a minute so they'd be hot when he was ready to eat, and then she served 2 bowls of the chicken and dumplings. When he came back into the dining room, he'd cleaned up and even combed his hair. Chicken and dumplings? He asked. If I'd known, I'd have been here hours ago. The fact that he admitted he could have come earlier irked Alice. Why didn't he come on time? Do you want me to start having supper ready at 9:30? She asked. He sighed, shaking his head. No. I'm sorry I'm late. I really did need to find this heifer. After their prayer, they both dug into the food. Alice found she was hungrier than she'd realized. She wasn't used to eating supper after 9 at night. He was halfway through his bowl when he asked, "How was your sewing party at your sister's?" "Fine," she said. She wasn't about to tell him everything Sarah had said. The woman was evil, and she had no desire to admit what a difficult time the other girl had given her. "Did you bring home any of Wilma's cookies?" he asked. Alice nodded. "I did, but then I ate them. I got hungry waiting for you to come home." She didn't tell him she'd gotten the receipt because she wanted him to be more considerate about coming home on time. She hadn't even realized she was angry with him about always being late until that moment. "Oh," he said, looking down into his chicken and dumplings. "Maybe next time." "Maybe," she said. "Do you want more bread and butter?" She didn't want to get it for him, but she'd been trained to believe it was her job to serve her husband at mealtime. "Yes, please. It was a really long day, and I haven't eaten a bite since noon." "Supper was ready more than an hour ago," she responded as she got up to get him more bread and butter as well as another bowl full of the chicken and dumplings. "Are you all right?" he asked. "I'm fine. I just wish you weren't always so late for supper. I've started trying to plan our meals for 7:45 when you seem to get home, and today it's 9:30. I hate when the meals go cold." "I'm really sorry," he said. "I'll try my best to be home at the right time from now on." "By 7. She nodded. "Then I'll plan suppers for 7. She couldn't believe how much better she felt after his apology. Maybe he wasn't deliberately trying to make her crazy, though he was doing a good job of it. He accepted the food from her with a smile of thanks. "Chicken and dumplings is my favorite meal, and you make them even better than Susan." Alice smiled. "It's always been a favorite of mine too. I feel like I've improved on my ma's receipt, which is what Susan probably still uses." He nodded. She never cooked often, but she always made special meals when she did. "Mrs. H doesn't make chicken and dumplings." "She should, but she doesn't." Alice smiled. "I'm glad you enjoy them. They're not easy to make, but I like them enough to make them often." "Good. I'll be happy enough to eat them as often as you're willing to cook them." After supper that night, they did their chores, and then went straight to bed, not making love for the first time since their wedding night. She knew she was reading too much into things, but it felt like he was already drifting away from her. Was he dreaming of Sarah with her chestnut locks and her terrible personality? She lay in bed for a long while, wondering if her marriage was already falling apart. Asterisk. The next morning, Alice was feeling guilty about her bad attitude of the night before, so she got up early, did all the wash, and then she followed Wilma's receipt to the letter, determined to make the toffee cookies just as well as her new friend had. While she worked, she saw a man she'd never seen outside, plowing up a patch of land for her kitchen garden. She was excited to be able to start planting. It was raining a lot, which meant crops would need to go in soon. At least that's what her pa had always told her. She poured a glass of cold water and took it out to the stranger who was plowing for her. "Mister? I thought you could use a drink." The man smiled and took the glass from her. "I'm Jason Carver." Her eyes widened with understanding. "You're Sarah's husband." "I am." "Whatever she said, please don't blame me." He took a huge drink of the water. "Apparently, she's not fond of marriage." "I got that impression," she said, not really willing to talk about it. "If you want more to drink, let me know." She turned to go back into the house, not feeling comfortable talking to the man now that she knew who he was. Susan had told her that Sarah wasn't the only one making trouble in their marriage. Back inside, she scrubbed the floors Albert had messed the night before. She'd mopped it up when it happened, but it needed a hands and knees job, and she was all too happy to do it. It was strange the pride she took in cleaning this house, when she'd complained every time she was expected to help clean her mother's house. She took a break to eat some of the leftover chicken and dumplings from the night before, starting when she heard a knock at the door. After opening it, she saw Jason standing there, holding his water glass. "Could I get a refill?" She nodded, leaving the door open, but not inviting him inside. She hurried to the kitchen and took a pitcher of water from the icebox where she put it to keep it cold and poured him another glass. When she turned to take it back to him, she found him standing right behind her, much too close for it to be appropriate. The front door was closed. "I don't think my husband would like for you to be in the house when he's not home," she said, handing him the glass. "Is that so?" Jason leaned closer to her, and she backed away. She knew if she screamed, no one would be able to hear her. "It is. Please go." "Now why would I do that?" He set the glass on the counter and put a hand on either side of her head against the wall. "How about a nice kiss?" "Go home to Sarah," she said, pushing at his chest. "I don't think so." He leaned down, trying to kiss her, and she turned her head away. Alice panicked a little, but then she remembered exactly what her brothers had told her to do if she was ever in a situation like this. She smiled at him sweetly as she brought her knee up, connecting right between his legs, just as she'd been taught. He doubled over and fell to the floor, and Alice hurried around him, taking off at a run towards Susan's house. If she was with someone else, she knew she'd be safe. The whole way she ran, she was sure she could hear his footsteps behind her. At Susan's, she didn't stop to knock, but opened the door wide, and yelled out for her sister. She turned and saw Jason standing in the doorway, his face red. "You should go now." "This isn't the end of it," he said with a scowl. Susan stepped into the room, a pistol in her hand. She held it leveled at Jason. "I don't know what happened, but I know my sister doesn't panic over nothing. You'll leave my property and never return." "Oh, yeah?" Jason stepped into the house, closing the door behind him. "You're not going to use that." Susan's hand was shaking, but Alice wasn't afraid. She took the gun from her sister and pointed it straight at the man. "Maybe she wouldn't use it, but I will." He faltered a bit, but kept coming, obviously not believing she knew how to use the weapon. Alice aimed for his shoulder and pulled the trigger. She knew it was the only thing that would work. He wouldn't let her knee him in the groin again. Her aim was true, and he fell to his knees. "You shot me." "I did. Now get out. You're bleeding on my sister's floor." Jason stared at her in shock. "You shot me." "I'm well aware." She cocked the gun. "Get out." Alice kept her voice calm, but she was deadly serious. "I'm happy to shoot your other shoulder." He half walked and half crawled out the door. "This isn't the end of it," Susan shouted after him. "No, it's not. The sheriff will be informed of what just happened." After Jason was gone, Alice ran and shut the door, locking it. "Thank you." Susan shook her head. "You were the one who shot him." "What happened?" Alice sank down into one of the dining chairs and took a deep breath before explaining everything that had just transpired. "I'm not sure how I'm going to tell Albert, but I'm not going home alone. I can't." She was shaking and still too frightened to think clearly. "Thomas and Walter will be home from school soon. As soon as they get here, I'll send them out to find Albert. He needs to know what happened and why you don't feel safe in your own home." Susan shook her head. "How did you learn to shoot?" Alice shrugged. "Earl and Wally taught me. They said I was going to get in trouble someday, and I was going to need to know how to shoot. They taught all of us girls, actually. Not Ida May." That brought a smile to Alice's face. No, not Ida May. They decided she was too young to learn to shoot, so they taught her to use a slingshot instead. She can hit just about anything that moves. But, she's a baby. Alice smiled. Ida May is 10. They taught all of us how to use our knee between a man's legs, and then they taught us to shoot, either a handgun or a slingshot. They said their sisters were going to be safe even if they weren't there to defend them. They're good brothers, Susan said with a smile. It never occurred to me they were doing good things, and not just running around pulling pranks. The sisters moved into the parlor, and they worked on the huge pile of mending Susan had in her sewing basket. While they sewed, they caught up on the family. Susan had been gone for so long that she envisioned her younger siblings as children still, when they were far from that. I guess I knew they were all getting married, but it seems like they should still be sitting in that apple tree throwing things at all the wagons that drove past. I had the best aim, Alice said, grinning at her sister. I'd say that isn't something to be proud of, but it obviously is. You just shot a man who more than deserved it. When the children got home from school, Susan sent both Walter and Thomas out, giving them the pistol Alice had used earlier. Find Albert. Tell him he's needed at our house, but make sure he knows everything is going to be fine. Walter's eyes were wide as he accepted the pistol, and they both went out to saddle their horses. As soon as they were gone, Susan looked at Alice. I guess I could have called David out the window. He's in the corral working, but he'd gone to town earlier, and I didn't know he was back. Alice shook her head. I'm still trying to figure out what I'm going to tell Albert, so the delay is probably a good thing. Susan shook her head. You're going to tell him the truth. You did nothing wrong. Then why do I feel like I did? I have no idea. But you need to stop. Susan wrapped her arms around her sister and held her. You didn't do anything wrong. Alice felt tears pop into her eyes. She couldn't believe she'd held them in as long as she had. Thank you for being my big sister, she said softly. We're both safe, and it's all going to be all right. Alice sniffled and pulled away, nodding. I know I did the right thing, but I was so scared. You should have been. Susan shook her head. I don't know why I didn't realize how upset you were earlier. Probably because your aim was so true. Alice giggled and wiped away a tear. Probably. You can thank Wally for that. I will write him a letter later, doing just that. Chapter 10. When Albert saw his younger brothers riding toward him, he raised his hand in a wave. He'd just finished moving a lost heifer back to the herd and was seeing if there were others hidden in various places. When Thomas and Walter pulled their horses to a stop in front of him, he frowned. Why were they on his land? He didn't mind, but they never rode on his land, preferring to ride along the road or on their father's land. Is something wrong? Thomas nodded. Ma gave Walter a gun and told both of us to come find you. She said to tell you everything would be all right, but you need to come back to the house. Alice is with her. Albert felt as if the earth was collapsing under him. What happened? They didn't tell us. Just told us we needed to find you right away. Albert turned toward the house and rode as quickly as was safe for his horse. He jumped the fence between the two properties rather than using the gate between them, glad to make the jump this time. When he got to his parents' house, he dismounted and hurried to the front door, only to find it locked. He pounded on the door with his fist. Susan? Alice? The door opened and Alice flew into his arms. He immediately wrapped his around her and held her close. What happened? Walter and Thomas said they were sent to find me, but they didn't know why. His gaze was drawn to the blood on the floor. Who's hurt? Alice looked over her shoulder at Susan. Guess we should have cleaned up the blood. I can't believe I didn't think of it. I was keeping you calm. I couldn't be expected to think about the puddle of blood. Will someone tell me what happened? Albert said, about to lose his temper if someone didn't tell him something. Alice couldn't make the words come out. She still felt too guilty about what had happened. Susan frowned. Let's go in the parlor, and we'll explain. Albert didn't want to go to the parlor. He wanted someone to tell him what was going on so he could get back to work, but he followed anyway. What? He asked, his voice filled with frustration. Your land was plowed today for the garden, Susan said, trying to get Alice to explain what had happened, but her sister was looking down at her hands and not speaking. I was called in from work because my land was plowed? He shook his head. You two need to start making sense. Alice took a glass of water out to Jason as a way of thanking him for the work he was doing. Jason? I asked Andrew to plow for me. I wouldn't let Jason be on my land without me right there in the house with Alice. Susan nodded. You were right to feel that way. When Alice realized she was dealing with Sarah's husband, she went back inside. After a while, he asked for another drink of water, and when she went to get it, he followed her into the house and tried to kiss her. What? Albert looked at Alice. He kissed you? Alice shook her head. No. I kneed him in the groin and ran here. Good for you. Albert sat there for a minute, thinking about what they'd said. Where'd the blood come from then? Their story still wasn't making a lot of sense. He followed, and I had to shoot him. Albert blinked a few times. You shot him? In the shoulder, which was right where I was aiming. I'm a good shot. Albert looked at Susan helplessly. She shot him? Susan nodded. And he bled all over my floor. I should clean that up. With that, she got up and left the room, leaving the newlyweds alone. He didn't hurt you? Albert asked, putting his arm around Alice's shoulders. She shook her head. He said this wasn't the end of it, though. We're going to have to talk to the sheriff. He's an evil man. I got that impression when I talked to him. He shook his head. Sarah never should have married someone like him. I think they're quite evenly matched, Alice said without thinking. Why do you say that? I was treated to Sarah's unpleasant side while we were sewing yesterday. She hadn't been planning to tell him any of this, and she was sorry it had come up, but now that she'd started talking about it, she knew he wouldn't let her stop until he heard everything. Sarah has an unpleasant side, he asked. I know you're in love with her. Apparently, the whole town knows you're in love with her. She said that as soon as she's available, she'll take you from me. What? How can she be available when she's married now? Alice shrugged. Only thing I can think of is the billy goat horn through the eyeball, but she may have poison or something like that in mind. Poison? Did she say she was going to kill him? No, I was just daydreaming. Maybe it could be 2 billy goats, one for each of them. Would that be too much to ask? You're distracting me, Alice. She didn't say she was going to kill him, did she? No, but she asked me how it felt to be married to a man who was in love with someone else. It was awful. Susan made her leave. Do you know she doesn't even clean her own house? Her mother-in-law comes over and does it. She said she should have married you because you're rich and you'd hire a housekeeper to keep her from getting calluses on her hands. That's ridiculous, he said. Why would I hire a housekeeper if I had a wife and no children? What would my wife do all day? Apparently, she would mess up her house and tell other women that their husbands loved her. At least that's what Sarah does. He sat still for a moment, thinking about the whole situation. She messes up her house? That's what she said. She refuses to clean. She said that Jason told her he'd hire a housekeeper when they married, but he doesn't have any money. That's why she should have married you. I never asked her to marry me. I went to school with her and thought she was pretty, but I never really knew her. If she's not even keeping house, I don't want to know what she's doing, other than stirring up trouble. He sighed. I'm sorry she talked to you that way, and I'm really sorry Jason cornered you the way he did. I'm proud of you for sticking up to yourself. You're not angry? I would have to be a very unreasonable man to be angry with you. We're going to get a pistol for our house, and you're to always keep it on you. Your apron has a pocket, doesn't it? She nodded. It does. I can keep it in there. I usually take one with me when I'm out on the range, but for now, I want you to carry that one. We'll do some practice shooting. No need. My brothers taught me to use a pistol. He eyed her skeptically. You're going to have to show me you can use one. The blood on Susan's floor isn't proof enough? Nope. Albert didn't go back to work that day, and instead he and Alice did some shooting. It didn't take him long to realize she was better with a pistol than he was. I'll have to get a new one for me. You keep using this one. After shooting practice, they rode out to the sheriff to tell him what had happened. I've had trouble with him ever since he moved here 6 months ago. You wounded him? The sheriff asked Alice. She nodded. I shot him in the shoulder. I'll be looking for him. He didn't really hurt you, but that's enough to spend a couple of nights in jail. It doesn't matter that he tried to hurt me? The sheriff removed his hat and scratched his head. I suppose it does. You stay safe. I will. Alice and Albert ate supper in town at the same little diner as before, and the same waitress came to the table. There's a man looking for you, the waitress said as she got to the table. That so? Albert asked. She nodded. He's got a wound in his right shoulder. I sure hope he's right-handed, because he seemed awful mad at you. Albert looked at Alice, who frowned. Maybe we should pick up that pistol tonight. You're going to spend days with Susan for a while. Alice nodded. Seems safe. As soon as they left the diner, they drove to the mercantile, where they purchased another pistol. Now I'll always have one, and you'll always have one, he said. Promise me you'll be with Susan. I promise. When they arrived home, there was blood on her floor. He came back here after I shot him. She shuddered, thinking of that man in her house. Do you want to sleep at Pa's? Alice shook her head. No. I'm not going to be frightened out of my own home. Good for you. Albert pulled her to him and just held her. I'm sorry your day was so difficult. Yours was too. Asterisk. It was several weeks before they saw more trouble. Every day Alice and Albert grew closer. No one had seen Sarah or Jason since the day of the shooting, and most of the community felt they were better off without the couple. Felicity, Sarah's mother, cried often that her daughter was mistreated and misunderstood, but she was the only one who seemed to care about their disappearance. Before leaving every morning, Albert made sure that Alice had her pistol in her apron, and that she was spending the day with Susan. She learned to just take her laundry to her sister's house and do it there. They ate their meals with Albert's family and only slept at their own home. Alice forgot to take her laundry to Susan's one morning, so she walked back alone, her pistol in her apron pocket where it belonged. She walked into the house and found the basket she'd gathered everything into and picked it up. A sound behind her had her turning, only to see Sarah and Jason standing there. Jason had a gun to Sarah's head. Alice's eyes widened. She hadn't prepared for anything like this. Slowly she put the basket on the floor, her hand going toward the pocket of her apron. You go for your pistol, and I'll kill her. Alice's hand stopped moving. Why do you think I'd be worried about you killing her? She's never been anything but unkind to me. Her words were true, but Alice had no desire to see the other woman dead. Is that so? She told me you two were friends, and you'd shoot me again if I was mean to her. Alice shook her head. That's not true at all. Why would you be unkind to your wife? She's lazy, and she tells me all the time that I'm not good enough for her. Well, that's rude. I'd want to shoot her as well. Alice shrugged. I'd rather you didn't do it in my house because I don't want to have to clean up the mess, but if you need to, then I guess you will. I'm heading back to my sister's house. We need to do the laundry. Alice leaned over and picked up the basket again, putting it on her left hip and turning so he couldn't see her reaching for her pistol with her right hand. When she had it firmly in her grip, she started toward the door. She had to get in touch with the sheriff. Wait. Jason called out. Why? What do you want from me? I want you to watch while I kill my wife. I'm not going to do that, she told him. She was surprised at how quiet Sarah had been through the whole thing. Instead of turning around, she kept walking toward the door. I want a wife who cooks and cleans like you do. I'm done with this one. You're going to leave with me. No, I'm not. Alice knew Susan was expecting her back, and the longer she took, the more likely it was that her sister would get help. She just had to keep stalling the man. If she kept moving, it should all be fine. Opening the front door, she stepped outside, Jason still yelling at her to stop, but he never fired a shot. He wanted her alive. He wouldn't hurt her. She was convinced of it. When she stepped outside, her pistol still in hand, she saw David and Albert on either side of the door, both with their own guns drawn. She refused to stay there and be in the middle of things. The men would handle it. Albert motioned for her to move away with his head, and she was happy to do as she was told. She'd rather hide behind a tree or the corner of the house and keep her pistol trained on the idiot with a gun to his wife's head. She moved behind the barn, setting down her basket, and turning to watch everything. As soon as Albert was in sight, Jason stopped aiming at Sarah and turned the pistol to Albert. She couldn't hear what he said, but she didn't care. She carefully took aim and pulled the trigger, shooting for his shoulder again. As usual, her aim was true, and not only did her bullet lodge in his shoulder, but it made him drop his own pistol. David went in and kicked the gun away from Jason while Albert ran toward her. I told you to get out of the way. I did. I just helped a little. We didn't need your help. We needed you out of danger. I wasn't about to let him shoot you. I love you too much for that, you fool. Albert blinked. Did you just tell me you love me and call me a fool in the same sentence? Well, of course. What else should I do? He wrapped her in his arms, not worried about what his father was doing behind him. I love you right back, you fool. She laughed. Maybe someday we'll be able to say those words without the word fool attached. It might take a while. Epilogue. It was just after the first of the year when Alice's labor pains started. She had wanted to have the doctor see to her delivery, but she went into labor during an ice storm. The only people who could make it over to help were Susan and Mrs. H. Her labor was quick, much too quick for her first child. At least according to Susan, it was too quick. Alice, though, it took much too long for the baby to come. Shortly after noon on the coldest day of the year, Rachel Grace Dailey made her appearance. She was perfect with 10 fingers and 10 toes. When she was presented to her father for the first time, he swore she gave him a smile, though everyone knew babies didn't smile when they were less than an hour old. She's the most beautiful baby in the whole world, Albert said, sinking onto the bed beside his wife. I was just thinking the same thing. Alice traced her finger along the baby's cheek. But I think I'm done having babies. If you still want that dozen, we'll have to adopt the other 11. That's fine. I don't think I want you to go through that again anyway. Not even for another perfect baby like this one. He rested his forehead against hers. You did good. We did good. She smiled at him. I still love you, fool. And I love you. Mama.